Hi, everyone. Today I want to tell you my life in New York. When I first arrived in New York, I felt like I had stepped into another world. The city was alive with energy, bright lights, honking taxis, and people from all over the world rushing through the streets. I had always dreamed of coming here, but now that I was finally standing in the middle of Times Square, I felt both excited and nervous. I had come to New York to start a new chapter in my life. Back home, I had always wanted to improve my English and become a doctor, but I knew that mastering the language was essential. That's why I chose New York, a place where I could learn from native speakers, experience different cultures, and push myself beyond my comfort zone. My first challenge was finding a place to live. I had booked a small apartment in Queens, a neighborhood known for its diversity. The first night was tough. The city never seemed to sleep, and the sounds of sirens, footsteps, and distant conversations filled the air. But I reminded myself why I was here, to chase my dream. The next morning, I stepped out onto the busy streets, determined to explore. I took the subway, which was confusing at first, but I soon got the hang of it. My first stop was Central Park. It was breathtaking, a peaceful escape from the city's chaos. As I sat on a bench, I overheard two elderly men speaking English. I listened carefully, trying to understand every word. Later, I walked down Fifth Avenue, amazed by the tall buildings and luxury stores. I stopped at a small cafe and ordered coffee, practicing my English with the barista. "How long have you been here?" she asked with a smile. "Just one day," I replied. "Welcome to New York," she said warmly. That moment gave me confidence. I knew that every conversation, every interaction would help me improve. My journey in New York had just begun, and I was ready to embrace every challenge that came my way. The next few days in New York were both exciting and challenging. I woke up early every morning, eager to explore and improve my English. Each day felt like a new adventure, but it also tested my patience and determination. One of my biggest struggles was understanding the fast-paced conversations around me. On the subway, people spoke so quickly that I could barely catch a few words. At times I felt lost, but I reminded myself that learning a language takes time. Instead of feeling discouraged, I decided to practice more. I carried a small notebook where I wrote down new words and phrases I heard throughout the day. One evening, I visited a bookstore near Union Square. I wanted to buy an English novel to help me improve my reading skills. As I browsed through the shelves, a woman standing next to me noticed my hesitation. "Looking for something specific?" she asked. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "I want to read an easy English book. I'm learning." She smiled and picked up a copy of The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. "This is a great book," she said. "It's not too difficult, and it's very inspiring." I thanked her and bought the book. That night, I read the first few pages using my dictionary to look up unfamiliar words. It was slow, but I was proud of myself for making progress. The next day, I decided to push myself even further. I joined a local language exchange group where people from different countries practiced English together. At first, I was nervous to speak, but the group was welcoming. I met a guy named Alex who was from New York. He spoke clearly and patiently corrected my mistakes. "Don't be afraid to make mistakes," he told me. "That's how you learn." His words stayed with me. From that day on, I started speaking more, even if I wasn't sure about every word. I ordered food in restaurants, asked for directions, and even started small conversations with strangers. New York was teaching me more than just English. It was teaching me confidence, resilience, and the importance of never giving up. As weeks passed, I started to feel more comfortable in New York. My English was improving little by little, and I was no longer afraid to speak. Every day, I challenged myself to have at least one conversation with a native speaker. Some days were easier than others, but I knew that every small step counted. One afternoon, I decided to visit a hospital in Manhattan. As a future doctor, I wanted to see what medical life was like in New York. Of course, I couldn't work or study there yet, but I hoped to find a way to get involved. When I arrived, I saw a sign for volunteer opportunities. Excited, I walked up to the reception desk. "Hello, I would like to ask about volunteering here," I said. The receptionist smiled. "Do you have any experience in healthcare?" "I am studying to become a doctor," I replied. "But I am also learning English." She nodded and handed me a form. "We always need volunteers. Fill this out, and our coordinator will contact you." I couldn't believe it. I might have a chance to be in a real hospital, learning and helping at the same time. It was a small step, but it felt like a big achievement. That evening, I met up with Alex, my friend from the language exchange group. We walked through Brooklyn Bridge Park, watching the sunset over the skyline. "How was your day?" he asked. "I applied to be a volunteer at a hospital," I said proudly. "That's amazing. You're really making progress." I smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. New York was no longer just a big, overwhelming city. It was becoming my home, a place where I was growing stronger every day. But I knew my journey was just beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, but I was ready to face them. A few days after submitting my volunteer application, I received an email from the hospital. My heart raced as I read the words. "Dear applicant, we are pleased to inform you that your application has been accepted. Please come in for an orientation session next Monday." I could hardly believe it. I was going to be part of a real hospital environment. Even though I would only be a volunteer, it was a step closer to my dream. On Monday morning, I arrived at the hospital early. The volunteer coordinator, Mrs. Thompson, greeted me warmly. "Welcome. We're happy to have you here," she said. She handed me a badge and a schedule. My role was simple: assisting patients by guiding them through the hospital, delivering supplies, and helping nurses with non-medical tasks. The first few days were challenging. I struggled to understand medical terms in English, and sometimes I had to ask people to repeat themselves. But I refused to give up. Every evening I went home and studied new words I had heard during the day. One afternoon, I met an elderly patient named Mr. Johnson. He was sitting alone, looking out the window. I approached him and said, "Hello, sir, how are you today?" He turned to me and smiled. "I'm doing all right, young man. What's your name?" "I'm John," I replied. "I'm a volunteer here." "Where are you from, John?" he asked. "I'm from another country, but I came here to learn English and become a doctor." His eyes lit up. "That's wonderful. You know, when I was young, I wanted to be a doctor, too." We talked for a while, and I listened carefully to his stories. It was the longest conversation I had ever had in English, and I felt proud. Before I left, he said, "You're going to be a great doctor one day. Just keep going." His words gave me confidence. I knew the road ahead was still long, but moments like these reminded me why I was here. New York had challenged me, but it had also given me hope. And this was just the beginning of my journey. Days turned into weeks, and my life in New York became busier. Every morning, I woke up early, went to my volunteer job at the hospital, and then spent my evenings practicing English. Some nights I was so tired that I wanted to give up, but I reminded myself why I had come here: to learn, to grow, and to become a doctor. At the hospital, I started to feel more confident. I could now understand most conversations, and I even learned some medical terms. The nurses and doctors were kind, often taking the time to explain things to me. One of the doctors, Dr. Patel, noticed my enthusiasm. "You're really serious about medicine, aren't you?" he asked one day. "Yes, I want to be a doctor," I said, "but first I need to improve my English and study hard." He nodded. "You're on the right path. Keep working hard and you'll get there." His encouragement motivated me even more. One evening, after a long day at the hospital, I met up with Alex at a small cafe. As we sipped coffee, he asked, "How's everything going?" "Tough, but good," I said. "I feel like I'm learning something new every day. That's the spirit." Alex laughed. "You know, you should try joining a storytelling group. It might help your English and confidence even more." "A storytelling group?" I asked, curious. "Yeah, there's one that meets every Friday. People share personal stories in English. You should come." At first, I hesitated. Speaking English in front of strangers sounded scary, but then I thought about all the challenges I had already faced. If I wanted to improve, I had to keep pushing myself. "All right," I said, "I'll try it." That Friday, I stepped into a small community center where the storytelling group met. The room was filled with people of all ages, all ready to share their stories. When it was my turn, I took a deep breath and began. "My name is John, and this is my story about coming to New York." As I stood in front of the storytelling group, my heart pounded. Speaking English with one person was already challenging, but now I had to talk in front of an entire room. I took a deep breath and began. "My name is John, and this is my story about coming to New York." At first, I spoke slowly, choosing my words carefully. I told them about my dream of becoming a doctor, my struggles with English, and how I found confidence through volunteering at the hospital. The room was silent, and for a moment I wondered if they understood me. But then when I finished, the group burst into applause. "That was amazing," one woman said. "Your story is so inspiring. You're really brave to share this," another added. I couldn't believe it. I had spoken in English, in front of strangers, and they understood me. It was one of the most empowering moments of my journey. After the session, Alex patted me on the back. "See, I told you this would help." I laughed. "Yeah, but I was so nervous." "That's normal," he said. "But the more you do it, the easier it gets." That night, I walked home feeling a new kind of confidence. New York had once felt overwhelming, but now it felt like a place where I belonged. I wasn't just surviving here, I was growing. The next day, when I arrived at the hospital, Mrs. Thompson, the volunteer coordinator, called me over. "John, I have some exciting news for you," she said with a smile. I felt my heart race. "What is it?" "A doctor in the hospital is looking for an assistant to help with research. It's not a medical job, but it's a great learning opportunity. I recommended you because you work hard and show real dedication." I was speechless. Me? Working with a real doctor on research? This was more than I had ever hoped for. "Are you interested?" she asked. I didn't even need to think. Yes, absolutely. As I walked through the hospital hallways, I realized how much had changed since I first arrived in New York. I had started as a nervous newcomer struggling with English. But now I was part of something bigger, stepping closer to my dream. And I knew this was just the beginning. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. My heart was racing with excitement and nervousness. Today was my first day assisting with research. Even though it wasn't a medical job, it was an opportunity to learn from real doctors and experience the medical world in New York. I met Dr. Wilson, the doctor leading the research project. He was a kind, middle-aged man with glasses and a warm smile. "John, welcome to the team," he said. We're studying the effects of different treatments on heart disease patients. Your job will be to help organize data, take notes during meetings, and assist wherever needed. I nodded eagerly. I'm happy to help, Doctor. The work was challenging, especially because many medical terms were new to me, but I didn't let that stop me. Every time I didn't understand something, I wrote it down and looked it up later. In the evenings, I spent hours reading medical articles and improving my English. One day, after a long research meeting, Dr. Wilson called me to his office. "John, I've noticed how hard you work," he said. "You ask good questions, and you're eager to learn. Have you thought about applying to medical school here?" I was surprised. I want to, but my English still needs improvement, and I have to pass the exams. He nodded. "That's true, but you're already making great progress. If you keep working hard, I believe you can do it." His words gave me hope. Maybe my dream of becoming a doctor in the U.S. wasn't as far away as I had thought. That evening, I met Alex for dinner. "So, how's the research job going?" he asked. "It's amazing," I said. "I'm learning so much. Dr. Wilson even asked if I've thought about medical school here." Alex grinned. "See, I told you, you're going places. You just have to keep going." I smiled, realizing how much had changed since I first arrived in New York. The city had challenged me, tested me, and pushed me out of my comfort zone. But it had also given me opportunities, friendships, and a sense of purpose. And I knew that this was only the beginning of my journey. Days turned into weeks, and I became more involved in the research project. Every day I learned something new, not just about medicine, but also about how to communicate better in English. I no longer hesitated to ask questions or express my thoughts. One afternoon, Dr. Wilson gave me a stack of patient reports and asked me to summarize the key points. At first, I felt overwhelmed. Medical English was still difficult for me, and I didn't want to make mistakes. But I took a deep breath and reminded myself how far I had come. I spent hours carefully reading each report, using a dictionary and online resources to understand complex terms. When I handed my summary to Dr. Wilson the next morning, he read through it and nodded. "This is good work, John. You're improving fast." Hearing that made me feel proud. Outside of the hospital, I continued going to the storytelling group every Friday. Each time I challenged myself to speak more naturally. One night, after sharing a story about my first subway ride in New York, an older woman approached me. "You have a gift for storytelling," she said. "Have you ever thought about writing?" Writing? I had never considered it before. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I loved sharing stories, especially about my journey. That night, I went home and opened my notebook. I started writing about my experiences in New York, my struggles, my successes, and the people who had helped me along the way. Writing in English was tough, but I saw it as another way to practice and improve. A few days later, Alex read one of my stories. "This is really good, John," he said. "You should share it with more people." "But my English isn't perfect yet," I said. "That doesn't matter," he replied. "Your story is powerful, and the more you write, the better you'll get." For the first time, I thought about combining my two dreams, becoming a doctor and being a storyteller. Maybe one day I could write about medicine, about patients, or even about my journey from a foreign student to a doctor in New York. That night I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't stop. I would keep learning, keep improving, and keep chasing my dreams, no matter how long it took. Because in New York I had learned one important lesson. Anything is possible. As my days in New York continued, I found myself balancing two passions, medicine, and storytelling. In the mornings, I worked hard at the hospital, learning from doctors and improving my medical knowledge. In the evenings, I wrote about my experiences, capturing the challenges and triumphs of my journey. One day, Dr. Wilson invited me to attend a medical seminar at a university. It was a chance to listen to top doctors discuss new treatments and research. I was excited but also nervous. Would I be able to understand everything? When I arrived, the lecture hall was filled with doctors and medical students. As the speakers presented their research, I focused intensely, taking notes and writing down unfamiliar words. At times, the complex medical terms made my head spin, but I didn't let that discourage me. During a break, I introduced myself to a few students. "I'm John," I said. "I'm volunteering at a hospital while improving my English." One of the students, Emma, smiled. "That's amazing. It must be tough learning medicine in a second language." "It is," I admitted, "but I love it." She nodded. "Keep going. A lot of great doctors started with challenges like yours." That evening, as I walked home, I thought about how far I had come. Just months ago, I was struggling to have simple conversations. Now I was attending medical seminars and networking with students. Later that night, I sat down to write. This time, I wasn't just writing about my journey. I was writing about the power of persistence, about pushing through challenges and believing in yourself. Maybe one day I would write a book about this experience. A book that could inspire others like me, people who had big dreams but faced obstacles along the way. As I put my pen down, I smiled. My journey in New York was still unfolding, but one thing was clear. I wasn't just becoming a doctor. I was becoming a storyteller too. As I continued my journey in New York, I found myself growing in ways I had never imagined. My English was improving, my confidence was building, and I was learning not just about medicine, but about life itself. One day at the hospital, Dr. Wilson asked me to assist in organizing a small workshop for medical students. "You've been doing great, John," he said. "This is a chance for you to observe more closely how we teach future doctors." I was thrilled. During the workshop, I watched as medical students practiced diagnosing patients, discussing cases, and asking questions. At one point, Dr. Wilson turned to me and said, "John, why don't you share a bit about your experience as a volunteer and your journey in medicine?" For a moment, I hesitated. Speaking in front of medical students felt intimidating, but then I remembered my storytelling group, my struggles, and how far I had come. I took a deep breath and spoke. When I first came to New York, I struggled with English. I wanted to be a doctor, but I knew I had to improve my communication skills first. Volunteering at this hospital has been life-changing. I've learned that being a doctor isn't just about knowledge. It's about connection, about understanding people, no matter where they come from. The room was silent, and then applause. Some students even came up to me afterward to ask about my experiences. That evening, I met Alex and told him what had happened. "You see," he said, grinning, "you're already combining medicine and storytelling." His words stayed with me. Maybe this was my path, not just being a doctor, but also sharing stories that could inspire others. That night, I opened my notebook and began a new entry. Today, I realized something. My journey isn't just about becoming a doctor. It's about sharing what I've learned along the way. Maybe one day my stories will help others who are chasing big dreams just like I am. And with that, I kept writing because my story in New York was far from over. Months passed, and I continued growing, both as a future doctor and as a storyteller. My confidence in English had reached a new level, and I was no longer afraid to speak, ask questions, or share my experiences. One evening, I received an email from Dr. Wilson. He wanted me to meet him in his office the next day. I wondered what it could be about. When I arrived, he smiled and handed me a letter. "John, this is a recommendation letter for you. I believe you have the potential to go far in the medical field. You've shown dedication, hard work, and a deep passion for both medicine and communication. If you decide to apply to medical school here, this might help." I was speechless. Just a year ago, I had arrived in New York struggling with English, unsure of my path, and now a respected doctor was supporting my dream. That night, I walked through the city reflecting on everything I had experienced. The struggles, the doubts, the victories. New York had challenged me, but it had also shaped me. I realized that the journey was never just about reaching a destination. It was about embracing every step, every lesson, every failure, and every small success. Moral of the story: dreams take time, effort, and persistence. The road will be full of challenges, but each obstacle is an opportunity to grow. Believe in yourself, step out of your comfort zone, and never stop learning. Because the greatest journeys are not just about where you end up, they're about who you become along the way. And with that thought, I took a deep breath, looked up at the bright New York skyline, and smiled. My journey was far from over. It was just the beginning.